I'd like to welcome you to this webinar that we are holding today. My name is David Chaundy. I'm the President and CEO of the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council, or APEC, and I would certainly like to welcome you to our webinar today. I know that we still have a number of people that are logging in and signing, but just in order to allow us to keep on time, we will begin today's webinar. Who would have thought that even 6 or 7 weeks ago that we would be at the beginning of February, that we would be here today hosting this type of webinar to talk about these types of issues. The situation on the ground has gone so rapidly that it's made challenging for businesses and governments and even researchers to know how to best respond. And last week, as we were assessing what role APEC might play in terms of providing insights, what we might say, how we might say it, and when we might say it, things were developing so rapidly late on Friday. And so I woke up around 3 o'clock Saturday morning thinking we are going to have to do something faster and sooner. So by mid-morning, I had a plan that had been approved and input from my staff. We had our virtual staff meeting on Monday morning, and within 48 hours, we have put together the webinar for you this afternoon. I also want to thank Craig Alexander, my co-presenter, for agreeing on Saturday at short notice, as well as Michael Leonard with the Atlantic Credit Unions, who are sponsoring today's session, for also responding very quickly on Saturday to be the sponsor for today's webinar. And so I just want to thank all the staff for a great work of trying to put this together at such rapid notice, but also just recognize that this situation is moving very quickly. We already had announcements within the last couple of hours on federal responses. So as APEC is the source for independent research, insight, and ideas vital to supporting a healthy, inclusive, and sustainable economy, we wanted to share some initial insights and thoughts about what's happening. But I would emphasize the assessing the potential economic impacts. We are not yet in a place where we can give you a quantitative estimates of how some of these impacts are going to play out. So in terms of our presentation today, I will begin with some comments from an Atlantic perspective in particular, and then Craig Alexander, the partner and chief economist with Deloitte, also a former chief economist at TD Bank, Conference Board of Canada, and having worked at the CD Howe, has lots of experience and perspective, and he will be providing more of a national and international perspective. I should just mention we will have time for Q&A, but I just want to emphasize we've had over 800 people register for this webinar. I believe at the moment we have over 600 on the line. So when we get to the Q&A feature using the chat, which you should see with the 3 little dots, the bubble sign, we will not be able to address everyone's questions. We will try to allow enough time to address the key ones. The webinar and the slides will all be available afterwards, and we will share that link with you. So this has been quite a year already in Atlantic Canada and nationally when we've seen some of the things that have happened. In Nova Scotia, at the end of January, we had confirmation that the Northern Pulp Mill was closing with a loss of 340 direct jobs, combined impact of close to over 2,700, $235 million lost in export revenues. In Newfoundland, we had what's been referred to as Snowmageddon, the city of St. John shutting down and businesses for 8 days as part of a state of emergency. Again, the impacts might be temporary, but another significant shock. We then had various blockades disrupting supply chains and creating long-term risks to competitiveness with limits to sea and rail traffic at the time. And then more recently, we've seen a huge drop in oil prices, particularly for Newfoundland and Labrador. Oil prices down more than 50%, which will contribute to more than $300 million lower royalties in that province. And as we saw back in 2014, will create cash flow impacts for the oil and gas sector, and we'd expect to see some modest cutbacks. The long-term risk if those prices remain low to future developments. So on top of all that, we then add the current coronavirus COVID-19 situation, which is the focus of our presentation today. So where are we in this situation? Well, what began as mainly concentrated in China back in January started to accelerate in Europe by late February, and now, of course, spreading in North America and around the world. And you see from this chart that we've seen very different experiences in different countries. You see countries such as Iran, Italy, and Spain are seeing very significant increases relative to their size of the population. We've seen some other countries, China, for example, that have now seen some stabilization. South Korea also seeing some slowdown in the rate of new cases appearing. Again, reflecting different responses to this situation. But it is important to note this is a global pandemic and it's impacting countries around the world and our international linkages. Here in Canada, we are seeing COVID-19 cases spread across the country. We are using some national data here for consistency and reliability. So these numbers may differ somewhat from numbers you're seeing in your own province from different sources. Ontario now has the largest number of cases in Canada, approaching 200, just ahead of BC. But 7 of the 8 deaths so far from COVID-19 have occurred in British Columbia. And then in terms of penetration, you see with these gold dots, relative to the size of the population, the highest penetration has been in those 2 western provinces, British Columbia and Alberta. And in Atlantic Canada, the number of cases to date is relatively low. However, to contain the spread of that, we are already seeing significant measures which will have economic potential disruptions. So as we think about these impacts, there's different ways that we can consider these. Some of these impacts will be temporary. For example, if you were planning to go away for March break this week and you postpone that trip till later in the fall, that is just a temporary relocation of economic activity. Instead of happening this quarter, it happens in a later quarter. There's no permanent loss in economic activity. It's just a temporary reallocation of when that activity occurs. And certainly we'll be seeing some of that as shutdowns happen. But we will also expect to see some permanent losses of economic activity. For example, if your March break trip next week or this week, or you decide not to reschedule that for this year, you are not likely to take 2 trips next winter. So therefore, we're seeing a permanent loss of economic activity this year. So again, you might be stocking up on toilet paper, as some people seem to have. That will provide a temporary boost. But you're not likely to consume more toilet paper over the period. That will just take away from future sales. So that's temporary, but there'll be other cases where we're seeing some permanent impacts. And then there's a potential for some long-term impacts. So we think about the cruise industry in particular. The question is, as we come out of this particular health pandemic, will there be any long-term change in the demand and willingness for people to go on cruises as a result of some of the experiences that we've seen in a few specific situations? So will there be a long-term impact on the demand for cruises? And that's where you will see some permanent long-term impacts. We can also think about the severity of the impacts. Some may be relatively modest and short-term. Many businesses are now trying to accommodate working remotely and digitally to continue to deliver their services. So there's some productivity impacts. Certainly trying to put together this presentation remotely with my staff. It's certainly not as productive as being in the office together when you can quickly go and talk to someone and discuss slides face to face. We will certainly see some of those productivity impacts. Then, depending on how long this situation lasts, we have the potential for moderate or more prolonged impacts. Again, the longer things are shut down, the longer bars and restaurants are closed, the longer international travel is closed, the longer this situation goes on, the potential for a much more substantial impacts occur. And then there is a risk for deeper economic dislocation. I think if we start to see some businesses unable to manage through this situation, starting to have businesses fail or see fairly significant layoffs, that will be a sign that this is really starting to deepen and to spread, and a potential for a much more serious and significant economic dislocation and slowdown. So I think that is the key risk, and that is why we've already seen policymakers here in Canada and globally trying to respond to ensure that what is a current disruption to ensure the health and safety of individuals in their countries and their organizations does not lead to this deeper and prolonged economic impacts. So in terms of the key risks, the immediate risks are really loss of income and loss of jobs for individuals who might be laid off, who are not able to work, who are quarantined at home. So the income effects that those individuals have. And again, as you think about your own business, any time, or think about your own operations, any time that you restrain your spending, you're not able to go to the store, you're not able to go to a concert, you stay at home and you don't spend money, although you are not spending, you are saving that money, you might spend it on something else, that is someone else's income as well. So as you cut back on your spending to help manage your own finances or your own business, that will then spill over to someone else's lower income. And so another business will have a lower income. They respond with cutting back on employment as well. So we do need to think about these things multiply through the economy. So our decisions at this time can have impacts on what might make sense for us as individuals to cut back, will multiply and cause a more substantial slowdown than what we might otherwise experience. So loss of income and employment for individuals is the key risks. And for businesses and organizations, it's really cash flow and supply chain issues. Their ability in the context of maybe a temporary loss of revenue and sales because they're forced to slow down because their employees can't work, can they keep going so that as things start to normalize and resume operations, that they have enough cash to support them? And can they maintain their own supply chain? Can they get the supplies they need? Can they get the workers they need? These are the key issues, which is why we're seeing policy measures increasingly targeted at these issues. So I think most organizations, and I'm sure you've been getting emails like I have, their first priority is clearly the health and safety of their own employees. And we've certainly done that at APEC with working from home. Secondly, trying to ensure that we can provide the services that our clients and customers expect. And so businesses and organizations are making those adjustments. But then the third is this long-term integrity of their operations, their supply chain, their financial welfare to ensure that they can continue to operate. I think those are kind of the three priorities that organizations have been working through. So how big could some of these impacts be? Well, let's suppose we shut down the entire economy for 1 week. And just doing the simple math would indicate that's a reduction in economic output or incomes of close to 2% if the entire economy was shut down for 1 week as part of the response to that. And you can kind of gauge if something was shut down for 2 weeks, the direct impact would be twice as big. Of course, we're not really dealing with that particular situation, but we are seeing substantial components of our economy shut down for a period of time, whether it's 1 to 2 weeks, maybe up to a month, longer in certain sectors. So again, if, for an example, if you shut down 10% of the economy for 1 month, that just immediately takes off over a percentage point in terms of our economic output. So you can quickly start to see how some of these measures impacting the economy can start to lead to some fairly substantial economic impacts. So some of the current estimates that Canadian banks have been producing have downgraded annual GDP growth for Canada by around 1.4 percentage points, with current Canadian economic growth forecast to be close to zero for 2020. So you're seeing some of those initial forecasts, and Craig will kind of talk about this when he gives his remarks. Most are currently forecasting 2 to 3 quarters of decline and then a recovery. So the key questions are really how long this will go on for. So at the moment, we have some expectations, but we really don't know how long some of these measures will last, whether we will see even more severe steps trying to contain COVID-19. And also we don't know how individuals, businesses, and policymakers will continue to respond to this situation. So again, there's a lot of unknowns. We've all heard or seen the rush and some panic buying that can have some additional disruptions if everyone thinks they're going to suddenly run out of toilet paper, for example. And we're dealing with a situation where we don't have a lot of data. That's why we've set up our own web pages, and we are now starting to compile and collect and synthesize information so we can get as quickly as possible a broad sense of what's happening in Atlantic Canada in different businesses and different industries, and then start to put this in some economic context. So I would like to reach out to you and encourage you to share your updates at our special email address that we've set up. And you can visit our website that talks a bit more about how we will preserve your confidentiality, the information that we are looking for, and we will synthesize that information. We will not reveal individual corporate information without permission, but we will synthesize that information and help people understand where are the key sectors that are most being impacted to help policymakers and other stands and other organizations understand how they can help to minimize the economic impact from these various measures. So we're talking about income effects, but also most of you are well aware there's been substantial wealth effects. We've seen stock markets reacting as they fear or anticipate potential economic impacts on corporate earnings. Craig may have some more perspective on the scale and rationality of that response, but wealth effects do have impacts. For example, last fall, as my daughter studied university, we did transfer some of the RESP savings to cash last fall. With the current decline in the stock markets, I'm very glad that for some reason I did that, because we would certainly not have as much money for their education in the next few years. But if you are facing retirement and you are seeing these declines, we are back to the situation we were in 2008, 2009, where individuals close to retirement that are still heavily exposed to stock markets will find themselves in this particular kind of situation where the retirement income will not be as large. So how quickly do markets typically recover? Let's look at some previous examples here for context. The 1980s recession was very steep. We saw almost a 40% decline in the stock market, but a very quick rebound down and back up within 2 years. The recession in the late 80s, early 90s was a much longer affair, but not as severe in terms of the decline in the stock market, taking almost 4 years to fully regain those levels. The Great Recession of 2008, 2009, that was again a very steep recession, steeper than what we saw in the 1980s, or almost as steep, seemed to recover within about 3 years, but then we had that second leg, and it took almost 6 or 7 years for that recovery to fully regain the value in the stock market. So as of today, we are currently down close to 30% in terms of the Canadian TSX index. And at this point, we're not quite sure whether this will be something similar to the 1980s, where we have this very sharp decline. And then as markets start to open up, as we start to see goods and people moving again, we could expect to see a fairly steep recovery. The risks are that this takes longer to recover from, and the effects are more longer lasting. So we get something closer to what we've seen in some of those other examples. So the impacts are starting to ripple across the economy, and certainly can be more severe in some sectors than others. And so this is a very qualitative attempt to look at some of those sectors that might be most impacted. Certainly in the healthcare, the focus right now is refocusing resources to be able to cope with any increase in cases, and certainly closing some medical clinics, recalling retired medical workers back to ensure that they have staff and medical resources to cope with any increases. We're seeing some impact on retail sector. So we've seen some panic buying, which again is temporary boosting sales as people try to stock up in case they're quarantined, but we're also starting to see shoppers stay at home. Relying on my daughter's trip to the mall in the last few days, the malls are very quiet. We're not seeing as much activity. Some stores are starting to reduce their hours. In the education sector, we've seen schools close for March break, and 2 weeks after in some provinces, many post-secondary education courses, particularly at university, have shifted to online. So we're not seeing the same dislocation. We're just seeing a temporary shift in terms of how education is happening. In the construction industry, we are seeing some signs of major project activity pausing. Muskrat Falls and Voisey's Bay have paused activity in Newfoundland and Labrador. Some visitor information sectors in the public administration sector related to tourism have closed. We are starting to see restaurants, bars, and hotels scale back or closing. In Nova Scotia, I think as of Thursday, we're seeing those restaurants and bars closed other than for takeout. Manufacturing, I think, is one of the key areas to watch because whereas most professional services like lawyers and accountants and others continue to do business, doing it remotely instead of face-to-face, doing it by telephone or video conference, manufacturing is clearly one of those sectors where you still need people working together at the plant. So I think that is one key sector to watch for as to how widespread any closures might be. Certainly we've seen one announcement here in Nova Scotia of Stanfield's closing temporarily. And as we're seeing reduced access to the temporary foreign worker program, that will have an impact on some fish processing plants in particular. As I mentioned, professional services continuing to operate, but we'll still see some dislocations. Transportation and tourism, sporting events, cultural activities, that's where we're seeing some fairly significant impacts because of that reduction in international travel, because of the postponement of the cruise season, for example. And then in mining, oil and gas, the double whammy of the lower oil prices are really partly related to COVID and the economic impacts, but also related to some other market developments. So I think you get the picture. This is fairly widespread, but the intensity will vary by sector. And that's where we are hoping to collect information from you and others to get a better sense of the potential changes that we're seeing in these sectors, and then to be able to scale that up to give a sense of what's happening overall. So in certain sectors, we are certainly seeing some potential impacts. In Atlantic Canada, average weekly spending at food services, so restaurants and bars, would be around $75 million in the period of March to April. Again, as I mentioned, Nova Scotia reducing sales. That gives you a sense of the potential weekly impact in terms of loss of revenues that those establishments are facing. Retail sales, average weekly retail sales in Atlantic Canada as of last March and April was around 750 million. So again, as you start to see stores close, as you see people staying away, you start to see how some of these economic impacts can start to increase fairly quickly. And then, of course, we've seen the closure of our cruise season temporarily. Last year, the ports of Halifax, St. John, Sydney, and Charlottetown received about 800,000 cruise passengers, expecting double-digit growth this year. Total passenger revenues last year would be around $54 million. So we're already seeing the season delayed because our season tends to be heaviest in the fall. The current economic impacts are more modest. Certainly no impacts on Sydney or Charlottetown at this time, but if that is delayed even further, and if people start to cancel their cruise ships for later in the year or have less passengers, you will see those impacts increase. What about our other exports? Here's a table just showing the top 10 merchandise export markets for Atlantic Canada, ranked by their value in 2019. We've identified the top 2 to 3 exports to those markets, and then cross-correlated that with the number of COVID-19 cases and the intensity of that. So commodity prices, as you see from some of these countries, will certainly have an impact on the value of our crude oil exports. Not quite seeing the same impact on iron ore prices at this stage, but clearly the message from this table is the US remains our biggest trading partner and the biggest risk if the border is also closed to the movement of goods. And my understanding is, although we are looking at a further tightening movement across the border, we are certainly trying to keep moving for goods and essential equipment and supplies. And that is really critical given how closely integrated the Canadian and US companies and businesses and markets are. China has been the epicenter of the cases, accounting for close to 45% of cases now, but the most rapid growth now is elsewhere in Europe. We have certainly seen some disruptions to our lobster exports to China with this suspension of cargo services. And we saw some fairly significant reports of declines in economic activity in China, although we are now hearing some reports that things are starting to begin to normalize. You see some of those other countries where we are seeing disruptions. Disruptions to air travel, to service clients in markets, the drop in demand in markets facing closures, such as countries such as Italy or France or Spain, and the loss of income in those markets will all start to filter through to our exports as we move forward. And it's not just about selling to these countries, it's also about our imports and our ability to maintain our value chains, our ability to bring in critical supplies or specialists. And this is a key growing risk as travel and borders are or remain shut down for any prolonged period of time. And the other point to note here that this is clearly a global pandemic. And we have shut borders and air travel to protect our own citizens, but our ability to reopen those travel networks and borders also depends on how quickly other countries are able to contain and deal with this pandemic. So it's not just the reaction and response in Canada that will be important for our global trade, it's what's happening in these other countries where some, such as Italy, have really struggled to contain the spread of this virus. So disruptions to international movement of workers. We've already seen some reports of concerns around planting for strawberries because we have typically 900 seasonal workers in Atlantic Canada in the first quarter. That will have some impacts for both the planting season and subsequent harvest because they're not Canadian citizens and not able to enter the country. In 2019, we had 1,600 temporary foreign workers. So again, sectors where that might be particularly important is seafood processing. So ability to maintain operations because of their inability to access that foreign labor supply will have some impacts. And again, 18,000 immigrants arriving in Atlantic Canada last year with provinces targeting further growth. We will expect to see some impact in terms of immigration numbers as this situation unfolds. Also, we see a movement of international people in terms of international students. We are close to the end of the school year and different universities are responding to this in terms of shifting to online. But there are certainly risks for the fall enrollment if the situation is prolonged and if individuals are not able to get all the information and papers and processes done in the current situation. China is clearly our largest source of international students. That's where the COVID-19 outbreak was centered, but we also see substantial numbers coming from Iran and France, where we've also seen some substantial outbreaks of COVID-19. So what are the policy measures that we are seeing in response to try and contain some of these measures? Well, we're seeing an increased number of announcements, and they really need to target the two issues I highlighted at the beginning, cash flow and income. Some of the initial measures highlighted on this slide were very much focused on liquidity and credit, lower interest rates, various measures to support liquidity in the financial system, and measures to support business credit and bank lending so that the private sector continue to lend to companies and individuals who need support temporarily through this crisis. And we saw some additional measures today, along with a deferral of any tax payments until August, which will, it's not a cost of 55 billion, but deferring 55 billion of tax payments from households or businesses to help them through this particular time period. So measures focused on liquidity and credit. And then, as we've seen with a shift in policies today, an increased focus on incomes. We'd already seen some enhancements to EI to ensure faster access for those who are quarantined, the work sharing program that provides income support to employees who are working less hours rather than being laid off, and providing them income support during that time, again, to try to reduce the economic dislocation. And then today's measures, expanding EI and the different programs to ensure that individuals have access to the income support that they need, boosting child benefit and the GST, HST credit for low income, again, trying to ensure that those who are most vulnerable have access to incomes, and a 10% wage subsidy for small businesses, nonprofits and charities, Again, recognizing the important role that nonprofits and charities have in delivering important social services. And again, just as APEC is a nonprofit, event registration, sponsorships, memberships could all be impacted as other businesses and typical supporters look to manage their own resources. So again, some important measures happening there. So a lot of things happening on the federal front, but we're also seeing provinces with their own programs, PI announcing a 25 million fund to help support its employees and businesses. So we will expect to see impacts on the federal deficit. We saw a very substantial fall of 66 billion in the last recession from a small surplus to a big deficit, taking 5 to 6 years to recover. Given the slowdown in the economy and the policy measures that we've seen announced in recent weeks, we would expect that deficit to more than double to what it was initially forecast to be. Similarly, on the provincial side, we saw a very substantial decline in provincial balances in the last recession. The blue bars shown in 2008 to the red bars in 2009, a fairly significant increase in deficits, particularly in the maritime provinces, and a huge surplus in Newfoundland was eliminated. We are starting this situation in a somewhat better position in the Maritimes, but again, we would expect to see a negative economic impact because of reductions in income and potentially measures to help offset that. Newfoundland is starting from a much more challenging position with a large deficit now compounded by lower oil prices and the effects of COVID-19. So that concludes the remarks that I wanted to make, giving you some context around the economic situation. And again, as I mentioned, this is just the first phase of our response. We have launched our own website where we'll be providing more frequent updates, but that gives you a bit of the Atlantic context. And now I'd like to hand over to Craig to provide a bit more of a national and international perspective on this situation.
Thanks very much, David. I want to thank APEC for letting me be a guest presenter on this webinar. Deloitte has operations around the globe. We have economics departments in 13 countries with chief economists that are monitoring what's happening globally. I'm the chief economist for Deloitte Canada, so I'm focused on the Canadian economy and businesses in Canada. So I'll give you a few observations that will really reinforce some of the messages that David already provided. The one thing I stress is that we do want to have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to probably try to give you only about 5 minutes of commentary, but I'm looking forward to your questions. So if we move along to my growth outlook, David, we can. So as mentioned, the global pandemic is having an enormous impact on the global economy, and the weakness is feeding through into Canada. If we look at global economic growth, odds are global economic growth is being reduced to around 2% in 2020. And if we look back in time, even though that's growth, that's actually at the level of a typical global recession. So we are actually in an environment where the global economy is likely to experience a recession, not quite as precipitous a decline as we had in 2008-09 when the global financial system seized up, but still a period of extraordinary weakness. It is very different this time around because of the nature of the shock that's happening to the global economy. This isn't just a demand shock. It's a supply shock, a demand shock, and then a confidence shock that's creating the headwinds on the economy. So for Canada, a lot of the impact is going to be felt through the commodity price channel, as already mentioned. Today, oil prices are, West Texas Intermediate crude is trading at about $22. That's down from 60 when we started this year. That's going to be a real blow to our oil leveraged provinces. Base metals and other commodity prices haven't declined as much, but they are being impacted by the global demand. And so as a consequence, the terms of trade for Canada is going to be hurt. The lower commodity prices is going to hurt our economy. Then there's the impact on Canadian exports, but it isn't just to the affected countries. It's global supply chains that matter. And so what we're hearing from our clients is that there's enormous stress on supply chains. Companies that can't get inventories that they were counting on with just-in-time inventory systems, and similarly having difficulty, getting their products out to markets, particularly with a lot of businesses shutting down to reflect the efforts in terms of containment. When we talk to the health officials, it's important to keep some of this stuff in perspective, right? So the health officials tell us that the COVID-19 is far more contagious than some of the other flus we've had, like SARS, but the mortality rates are lower. So it is like other epidemics in the sense that, at some point it is going to burn itself out. The key right now is reducing the spread, and that's why there is the really pronounced efforts around containment. Because if we start to see, and I often get asked, like, what should I monitor in terms of how things are going? Like, which economic statistics? In point of fact, what you want to look at is the number of net new cases each week. Because when you start to see that curve start to bend, and you start to see the numbers of net new cases, new cases still happening, but at a diminishing rate, that's your signal that we're actually on the path to improvement. That's what we saw in China. I've actually had a lot of clients ask me whether we should believe the Chinese economic statistics that are showing that China is increasingly getting back to work. Not back to normal, because the global economy and all the restrictions happening in the global economy, but in terms of China, there is strong evidence that the containment has been effective, and as a consequence, you are getting more economic activity. So if the global containment efforts are successful, we would expect that ultimately the flu will burn itself out. The other thing is that we should be mindful that we are still in what is typically known as flu season. And so that one of the hopes is that as we get past the traditional flu season from an environmental point of view, you will also start to see a decline in the number of cases. So as a consequence of these effects, the disruption to economic activity, plus the enormous financial distress that's taking place, that's creating negative wealth effects, I think the tracking for the Canadian economy was a small contraction in Q1. I'm more negative than some of the other banks that David had mentioned, because I actually have the national economy contracting this year by 0.2. I think we're going to see at least a 3.5% contraction in Q2, and then some decline in Q3. The reason why, I actually don't think I'm off consensus on this. I think the issue is people's forecasts have been changing by the day based on the new information they're getting. One of the questions in the chat feature was, how long can stocks continue to decline? And the issue is that the behavior in markets right now is irrational. The degree of fear in markets, I would argue, is excessive. And that's actually why we needed strong policy actions, but the policy actions have not yet managed to restore confidence. The Bank of Canada has cut rates. I think the Bank of Canada will ultimately take the overnight rate to close to zero. I do think that they'll cut at least another half point, if not 75 basis points. But I would highlight that in this environment, based on the type of shock we're having, monetary policy is not going to be the most effective tool. Fiscal policy can be targeted more effectively, because as David said, the two big issues here is the disruption to personal income and the disruption to cash flows. What we effectively need to do is, having told Canadians to stay home, we now need to give them the income support so that they can get through until it's time to go back to work. And similarly, from a business point of view, we desperately need fiscal support for businesses so they can weather the valley. I would stress that it is a valley. I would stress that when we think about this, we're talking about an issue of months or a couple of quarters. We're not talking about years. And when the tide turns, it's going to turn very, very quickly. In terms of Deloitte's core messages to our business clients that we're helping to advise on how to get through this environment, we basically would argue, number one, take care of your people. Your people have to come first. Number two, focus on business resilience and business continuity, right? The key here is, look at your liquidity situation, look at your cash flows, think about your supply chain disruptions. The key here is to figure out how you're going to get through the valley of several months, if not a couple of quarters. Number three, keep in mind that you can make strategic decisions in this environment that will actually pay large dividends down the road. For governments, a good example of this is, if we start to be able to deliver virtual care, like virtual health care, right? Once you've actually done something like that, that it improves the healthcare service, when we're out of the crisis, we'll still benefit from that. Businesses that figure out how to deal with remote working are going to benefit from this when we get to the other side of the crisis, right? So there is long-term gains that can be made if you make really strategic decisions in this environment. The last point I would stress is that you do need to be prepared for the rebound. At the moment, we're all talking about the downside risks. We're talking about quarters of economic contraction, but understand the tide will in fact turn. And when it turns, it's going to probably turn very quickly, and businesses need to be nimble and prepared for that upside, right? So be realistic about the challenges in the near term, but also don't lose track of the fact that at some point we're going to have a real rebound in economic growth, which I expect will happen towards the end of this year. I'm going to stop there because it's really important that we answer your questions.
So thank you, Craig, for that. You can use the chat feature to ask your questions. Again, I would like to thank the Atlantic Credit Unions for their sponsorship of today's webinar. Because we have over 600 people online, we will not be able to answer everyone's question. We will try to take the key themes, but please use the chat feature to ask your question to the panelists, and we will try to respond. And a question that has come in, and maybe Craig, you might want to respond to this one, just around the impact of higher personal debts in this situation and how that might have an impact given the potential dislocation to incomes at this time.
Yeah, this is one of the big concerns. Not only are we going to have a disruption to household income, and you're going to have people that, if they were traveling abroad and they come back and they're in, they're basically self-quarantined for 2 weeks, and their employer says, you can't come into work, but I'm not going to pay you. You ask the question, how is that person going to make their rent payments, right? And so that's where some of the government announcements is about how to help incomes. But then there's also the issue around Canadians are carrying more debt today than they ever have before, and even small changes in their income levels could actually impact their ability to meet their finances. I think the bottom line here is that the Canadian banks are likely to show increased flexibility for individuals that are running into debt problems. One of the core recommendations is go talk to your financial institution and talk about making adjustments to the payment schedules. I think that there's going to be a lot of, I think that the governments and regulators are likely to put a lot of pressure on banks to be more flexible in this environment. But I also think it's in the bank's interest to be more flexible, both for personal debt and for business debt. I think that when I was at the TD Bank, there was a very strong sentiment that if you pulled lines of credit on people when they really needed help, you will lose that customer for all time. And so often, not giving that additional flexibility and support to individuals and small businesses has long-term costs. And so this is something that, banks are aware of. And as a consequence, I think this is an environment where banks and lenders will generally try to get you to the other side. I suspect credit unions are going to be in exactly the same situation, if not more, because of how close they are to their members.
So Craig, we have a number of questions coming in. One is around, and some you might want to respond to, around kind of lessons from 9/11 and how to prepare once we respond. But there was a question just around, can we see people in disrupted sectors like restaurant retail being redeployed to other sectors like seafood processing and agriculture? Certainly, yes, that's potentially important. I think the concerns here around how long these measures will be in place, the location of those activities, because they are not likely in the big centers, and then it's the nature of the work and the location of that work are probably going to be some barriers. Is it possible in the short term? Yes. Are those people willing to make those moves? And also, would they be able to actually do that, again, given that people are being advised to stay home? So I think there are some limitations as to how we can reallocate the labor when everyone's being advised to stay home at that time. But question, Craig, on the 9/11 situation and recovery, implications for negative interest rates, and how people can be prepared for once the economy responds. Any quick responses to those questions?
Well, I do think that businesses, in particular financial institutions, need to think about the possibility that you could have negative interest rates. That, you know, I don't expect that that's going to happen. But if the Bank of Canada, like the Federal Reserve, takes short-term rates to virtually zero, and you have negative bond yields in Europe, Japan, if there's a lot of buying of Canadian debt, you could actually end up with a negative rate situation. I don't think the Bank of Canada is going to. The Bank of Canada clearly doesn't want to do quantitative easing, where they buy debt in the market, which is how you engineer negative interest rates. They clearly don't want to do it, but if things got worse enough, they could. And so I actually think in this environment, businesses need to do some stress testing. Don't just don't look at the base case from forecasters like myself. You need to think about scenarios. And one of the scenarios I absolutely would consider, I absolutely would consider is you know, the implications of negative interest rates, because boy, that would be a real distortion for any financial institution. You know, in terms of, does the 9/11 situation recovery therefrom having lessons, which is helpful for us? I mean, one of the big lessons from that period was, you know, governments need to act strongly and quickly, and that if you inject large amounts of stimulus, you can have an impact on confidence. Now, you're not seeing that today in the marketplace with, you know, the TSX down about 7%. In the wake of the government's announcements, but the reason it's down is because that's what U.S. markets are down. So it's not a loss of confidence in terms of what the government's communicating. It's really a reflection of what's happening in global financial markets. I really do think a lot of the issue here is around confidence, right? If we can get the degree of fear to diminish, if we can get people to, you know, investors to calm down, I actually think we will be able to dig ourselves out of this. But the environment of fear raises the risk the economic costs are going to be greater.
So we've got a number of questions coming in. One, Craig, is specifically directed to you, and another one related in terms of advice for employers in terms of how they can help their employees, and particularly for employers who've got employees who have parents of young children who can't go to school or daycare, so they're at home trying to look after them. What advice is Deloitte giving to employers in terms of being able to look after their people in these types of situations?
Yeah, like I said, your people come first, right? I mean, the business still needs to be viable, but at the same time, you know, this is an environment where you need to focus on the safety and well-being of your people. At Deloitte, all 15,000 of our employees are now working remotely. Now we're well configured for that sort of environment. The same isn't going to be true for businesses where, you know, remote working isn't an option. I do think it's an environment where, you know, if you can, you know, whatever degree of flexibility you can provide is really important. You know, if you know, it may be the case that you need to reduce your hours in order to, you know, operate with the employees that can come into the office. If you don't, or into the plant, if you don't have a good flexible workplace. But ultimately, you know, we need to balance those family obligations with the firm obligation and to the business obligations. You know, this is a really important time for businesses. You know, please provide your, you know, my recommendation is provide maximum flexibility as you can to your employees, And keep in mind that this is a good long-term business decision, because if you support your workers in these difficult times, it can actually build a lot of goodwill on the part of your employees, and it can help with retention, it can help with development. But we need to be practical. There's flexibility that you can provide, and then flexibility you simply can't.
And certainly, I think that also touches on another question. Atlantic Canada's already been facing workforce pressures, so finding ways to retain your labor during these situations will certainly be very helpful to ensuring that as things start to pick up, you have the labor that you need to respond. I'd like to just pick up on a question just around the charitable sector. Some of the announcements today was targeted at helping small businesses, nonprofits, and charities. So again, I think there's a recognition of that. We have a report that has just been completed on the nonprofit sector here in Nova Scotia, emphasizing the importance of financial stability and funding stability for that sector even before this crisis. They rely heavily on volunteers to deliver their services and provide very important services. So our report highlights that, and the current situation has them in very similar situations where their ability to draw upon their volunteer base, because people are staying at home, their ability to provide some of these core services is also being compromised and having to find, I know a food bank that my wife volunteers at, trying to do things differently to continue to serve those important clients. But again, there are certainly risks to those sectors where people who would normally support those, whether they're corporations or individuals, might, just because they're looking after themselves, be less willing to volunteer, less willing to donate. So again, I think it's very important that where businesses have that corporate social responsibility mandate as part of their organizations, that they continue to look after not just their own employees, but also the organizations that they support that are also trying to help care for those most vulnerable.
Well, one thing I just add on the taking care of people dimension, I mentioned before about now's a good time for strategic decisions that could pay off longer term. You may find that you need to figure out how to do more remote working, and you might need to make additional investments in terms of digital capacity. But this would be a long-term payoff, right? This is something businesses are going to need to do anyway in terms of moving to a more digitally based business model. So again, this is beyond just figuring out how you adjust your current production flows, etc. Anything you can do in terms of increasing sort of the digital capabilities of your firm in its operations, if it's appropriate for your company, now is a really good time to do it.
So I know we've got some specific questions coming in around specific sectors. I'm not sure we're going to be able to have time to respond to that, but all the questions that are being posed, we will try to process. And as we start to provide information on our website around the impacts that we're seeing on certain sectors, we will certainly try to address those on our website. So go to our website /COVID-19 and you will see those /COVID. You will see our analysis appearing there. We've been focused on the webinar for the last 2 days, but now we've done the webinar, we will start to add information as we are able. Questions for you, Craig, just around, what if this is not kind of the short-term process around containment that a lot of banks and yourself are currently forecasting. What's the potential or implications of this if it is more prolonged?
Yeah, and this relates to what I was saying before about thinking about scenarios, right? Like, the health officials are hopeful that with the end of flu season, this is going to help in bending the curve in addition to the actions we're doing on containment. But we don't know about this virus, right? We don't know how it's going to behave as the environment changes. So could it linger longer? Yes. The other scenario that I'm really worried about, or economists often get asked, like, what are the scenarios that make you lose sleep? When we start to see increasing cases in, say, Africa, South America, India, I really worry about the extent to which those regions can do containment. I mean, China was, in a sense, because of their economic and political system, they were probably the best designed to actually do containment. It's much harder for other countries, and in some cases, like in Africa or India, it's not clear to me how you would do the actual containment. So, if the flu doesn't burn itself out, or if the epidemic or pandemic continues, then obviously the economic costs are going to be far greater. One of the questions that came up earlier was something about, around, should we be concerned about government debt in this environment? To be honest, I'm Scottish and an economist, so you can just imagine how cheap I am. And I'm a fiscal conservative, and I will tell you, now is not the time to worry about deficits and debt, right? This is an environment where we really need governments to step up, open their purses, and spend money. And when we get to the point where the rebound has happened, okay, at that point we can then deal with the fiscal consequences. I just, in the current environment, I really think it's important that we do whatever we can to basically mitigate the impacts on income and cash flows. I think one of the things I would stress from today's announcements on fiscal policy is, the government has announced fiscal stimulus, but you know what? I think it's only the start. Like, one of the things that we didn't have today was announcements around financial support for specifically hard-hit industries. And you just know that is coming. So I do think that there's a risk this could run longer, the economic costs are greater, but that's also why you should stress test your business plans. Think about scenarios where things are worse than what you're currently planning on. If you need inputs to those sort of plans, talk to the economics community, people like me that do economic scenario forecasting. And stress your business and figure out and think about what you're going to do if this does last longer.
Thank you, Craig. And again, I think, some of those key sectors that are particularly important are the airline industry. We've already seen reports, British Airways warning about risk. We've seen signs from WestJet too. You have to understand that we live in a globally connected world. And as we start to see a resumption of economic activity in those borders and international travel, we need airlines to be able to facilitate that. So those would be a couple of, that would be one key sector where governments may need to step in to help companies through that, because we do need that capacity to continue to travel, not just for personal interest, but for our global supply chain. So again, I think, as Craig mentioned, we supported the auto sector during the last decline. I think that's one sector where we can expect to see some support. There are a number of questions coming in. Again, the recording and the slides will be available on our website by noon tomorrow. Yes, you can share that with anyone that you want to. Feel free to do that. As I mentioned, on our website, we will be providing more detailed information as we compile that. And Craig, we are getting close to the end, so I just want to give you a final chance. You might have seen some of the other questions that have come in. Any final closing comments that you would like to make before I bring this to a conclusion?
Sure. My last point is you're going to see lots of announcements about things that are out there to support businesses. I would encourage you to investigate all of your options, all the things that are available to you to help you through these times. One of my questions to both the federal government and to some of the provincial governments is, Export Development Canada and Business Development Canada are going to get expanded funding to help businesses. One of my questions was, do you think businesses fully appreciate, the possible supports that are out there? And the general consensus was no, right? Businesses may not be fully aware of, what their financial institutions, what Export Development Canada, what Business Development Canada can do to support them. So it's going to be very important to keep abreast of all of the announcements around things to help you through these difficult times. You also want to keep in mind, or you also want to explore, all the financial options, because again, keep in mind, and this is my absolute core message, this is a valley. We will get to the other side. This is a temporary environment. We just don't know, exactly the timing on when we're going to get the rebound. The key is managing during this period of uncertainty through that valley. And if we need to maintain that mindset.
So thank you, Craig. And that's certainly, if you look at that slide that I shared earlier on the stock market, we clearly see declines, but we do see those rebounds. How much they decline and how long it will take to recover, as with the economy as a whole, that's why we are continuing to track and assess this. So again, I do want to thank you, Craig, very much for joining us. I know you've already had multiple webinars that you've been doing today. So I do want to thank you very much for participating with us today. So please, if you're not already a member on our mailing list, I encourage you to sign up for updates. We will be providing further updates as we continue our research on COVID-19. We will be sharing some of that information via social media, including Twitter. So again, we encourage you to follow us to make sure that you have access to that information. Some of you have asked about resources on our web pages there. We do have some resources for businesses where we're seeing other people with that information. We are starting to compile that and share that. So again, I'd encourage you to look there because you might find some helpful information. One last question was around credit cards. And I think what we're seeing in the situation is businesses and organizations will be increasingly flexible to ensure that people who are able to pay bills, who are able to make payments, I think you will see a lot of organizations being flexible and responsive so that we can all work together in this situation. So as Craig emphasized, we will get through this. We're just not quite sure how long and how deep it will be. So we are trying to support that through our economic analysis. So again, I encourage you, we'll be sending out a survey very shortly, and encourage you to provide your feedback on that. Visit our website and also share your economic updates with us because that is how we will be better able to track what's happening in key businesses and industries. So I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to join us. Again, the Atlantic Credit Unions for sponsoring this session. The recording and slides will be available on our website, so please check back. We will email you. And again, thank you very much to Craig Alexander for joining me this afternoon. Thank you and take care and look after all those in your families, your communities, and your employees as well.